Hi everybody, and welcome to the BBC's Earth Polar Bear Takeover with Explore.org. We are from Polar Bears International, and we are live on the shores of Hudson Bay with a polar bear right behind us and others just outside. We are on the Frontiers North Adventures Buggy 1. Frontiers North donates Buggy 1 to Polar Bears International to bring up scientists and experts in all different fields so that we can connect with people all over the world and bring polar bears right to your homes. So today, you can send in any questions you might have about polar bears. Use the hashtag Polar Bear Takeover, and you can put that, you can send the questions in through Facebook, put it on Twitter, in the chat window if you're watching through Explore.org right now, and I'll get those questions and pass them on to our experts. So with me today are two of the top polar bear biologists in the world. On my right is Dr. Steve Amstrup, the Chief Scientist for Polar Bears International. And on my left is Dr. Andy Derocher, polar bear scientist at University of Alberta and my supervisor for my research. So maybe I'll let you two give a short introduction of yourself and your own research. Steve, you want to go first?
Hi. Yeah, I'm currently the chief scientist at Polar Bears International. I've been there since 2010, but prior to that I did polar bear research in Alaska for 30 years. And I won't go on for very long, but one of the things I think is really interesting to note is in that 30-year period, less than a working lifetime, I saw tremendous changes in the Arctic, tremendous changes in the habitat in Alaska. And hopefully we'll get into some of those changes here today and the impacts that they are bringing to polar bears.
Thanks, Steve. Andy?
Andy Derocher, I'm a professor at the University of Alberta, up here as a volunteer scientific advisor with Polar Bears International. I started working on polar bears in 1984 in this population. It's incredible to see the changes that have come not only in this area but in other populations I've worked in as well. I worked for the Norwegian government at the Norwegian Polar Institute for 7 years and studied polar bears in Svalbard. Currently, we're also running research around the Canadian Arctic. It's interesting. Long time ago, when we first started looking at this question, we thought that the challenges facing polar bears were long time into the future. It's amazing to see how quickly things have changed.
Thanks, Andy. Now, we already have lots of great questions rolling in, but be sure to keep asking. We'll get started with what we have right now. So we have a question from Anne. On average, how many seals does an adult polar bear eat in a day? Steve?
Well, I think it depends on the size of the seal and the size of the bear, but if you think of an average size bear and an average size seal, about one seal every 6 days or so I think is a pretty good estimate. But again, it's highly variable. Big bears require more food than smaller bears, and big seals provide more food than smaller seals.
Right. And Andy, maybe you could talk a bit about the hyperphagia that polar bears might go through in the spring?
Well, and this is the interesting thing is, of course, the bears that are around us right now, they're on land. They're not feeding much. They'll pick at kelp and things like that. But really what they want to do is to be out on the sea ice, and the main period of the year where they're making their living is the springtime, when the two main prey species of polar bears give birth to their pups. So that's ring seals, that's what I call the small meal deal. They're up to about 70 kilograms, 150 pounds. And then the big meal deal is a bearded seal, which can be upwards of 400 kilos or over 800 pounds. And it really is that spring period when mothers give birth to their pups. The pups are vulnerable. And also the mothers are also vulnerable at that time as well. So it's really that period of the year, sort of that 2 to 3 month period where the polar bears are essentially what I call fat vacuums. We think about polar bears as being the most carnivorous of them, and that rely on to build up this large fat store so that they can come on shore and undergo these prolonged fasting periods and just use that energy store and bleed it off over the months that they're on land.
Thanks, Andy. And this leads us into something else. So this polar bear behind us right now that you can see on the screen, we've had a few out here today that are snacking on the kelp. And we have a question from Baby Peas that says, PBI has said the bears eat kelp mostly to keep their mouths busy. I realize they cannot put on weight eating it, but since it is so nutrient rich, surely the bears benefit from eating it. What do you think?
Well, I'll make a first stab at that. So we know that bears have a simple stomach. They can't digest the cellulose, the lignin, the other compounds like that are in the kelp. So they can't derive very much in the way of energy from the kelp itself. They might get some vitamins, some minerals that might improve their electrolyte balance. And it could be that these windrowed areas of kelp have small organisms in them, small invertebrates, maybe little crabs, insects, things like that. And the bears may be getting something out of that. But I think it's important to realize that there isn't enough in there to maintain a polar bear's weight. They can't come in and munch on kelp and replace the seals that they would have been eating had they still been out on the sea ice.
I think it might be sort of like a bit like a salty snack for them as well. It's probably it's a nice way to pass time, but it's like if you look at a lot of mammals, they'll also go around and use salt licks and things like that. So they're getting a diversity of nutrients from salt licks, and I think this is probably not bad. It's probably fermented. It's been sitting on the beach for quite a while, so it's decaying. So it's probably a little bit more digestible. But it's also clear when you watch a polar bear eating kelp for long periods of time, pretty much what comes in looks awfully familiar on the back end going out.
Okay. We have a question from Joe Bear. It says, I was reading that the evolution of polar bears began about 38 million years ago. Do you think that they can just evolve to survive global warming and the shrinking sea ice season?
The evidence that we have from genetics suggests that polar bears may have split off from a common ancestor with the brown bear perhaps as recently as 500,000 years ago, and perhaps as long ago as 3 to 5 million years ago, although I think most of us believe it's in the more recent time frame. But the critical question is, given the changes that are occurring in their environment now, can a polar bear undo even 500,000 years of evolution in, say, a couple of decades? And I think it's pretty clear that they can't. Polar bears have specialized to this environment over many, many millennia, and the environment is going away much more rapidly than anything that they've encountered before. People have said, well, polar bears have been through warm cycles in the past, and that's true. They have been through some warmer periods in the past, but we're likely to see in the next 50 years temperatures that far exceed anything polar bears have ever seen in their evolutionary history. So looking into the past isn't a very good example for what we might experience in the future, because what we're doing now is entirely unnatural. This warming is human-caused. It's not part of a cycle. We don't expect to see the same phenomena as we have seen in the past.
I think one thing I'll add to that, Steve, I think that's a great overview, but we've got this bear eating kelp behind us, and people say, well, there's perhaps evidence of adaptation, but it's not. It's just part of the normal behavioral range that these species have. We have good evidence that goes back to some of the very first explorers in the Arctic talking about polar bears eating foods on land, that some of them would shoot bears, and there's reports they opened up the bear and it looked like a giant scrambled egg inside. And so bears have been eating eggs forever. And so one of the things that's happened is, of course, some researchers that aren't that aware of the literature and the history are saying, well, this is something new. It's not new. Polar bears have always eaten almost anything they can get their teeth on, and this is just part of their normal range of behavior. But the reason they can eat these other food resources is because they have access to this incredibly energy-rich store that comes from eating seals out on the sea ice.
Yeah, I would add one other thing to that too, because we hear a lot about this. Well, how can polar bears make a living on land? Can they survive on land? And one of the things that's really important to recognize is there's a difference between observing a bear eating something and whether or not that's having an impact on their energy balance or their nutritional balance. And at the very time that we see these bears eating kelp and sometimes eating goose eggs or other things on land, the average weight of bears in this population is declining. Their survival rates are declining. So if we were seeing that these foods were benefiting them, what we would see is those negative trends would be turning around. The bears would be maintaining their weight or gaining weight, and their cubs would be surviving at a better rate. And we're not seeing that. So we don't seem to be seeing any evidence that suggests that the things they can get on land are really valuable, certainly not at a population level.
Thank you, guys. We have a question about what we see out here right now. So we're watching this polar bear He doesn't seem to. Well, looks like he's going to go check out a buggy right now. One of the questions, people are seeing a little bit of sparring on the cams. And Catherine wants to know, we currently see a lot of play sparring out on the ice. Have you ever seen a serious fight between these polar bears, either near the lodge or out on Tundra Buggy 1? Do things get real?
Well, we'll never see the real serious sparring on land at this time of year. This is not the time of year when the bears are fighting for anything. This is kind of the time of year where there's no mates to fight for, there's no food resources to fight for. So the bears really aren't at all in any sort of competitive move. In contrast, the big males are actually incredibly social at this time of year. So their whole social system shifts to being much more friendly at this time of year. A lot of the play behavior that we're seeing right now is probably tied to skill development and maybe sort of trying to figure out where you fit in the hierarchy of the polar bear world, because during the springtime, when male polar bears are going to be a lot more keen to fight for mates in particular, those are basically a drop your gloves, no holds bars sort of event. They're incredibly violent, and if you get two very evenly matched bears, there's going to be some pretty serious fur flying. I've seen bears with broken limbs, broken teeth, bears blinded, massive wounds that come from those fights. I once, when I was working in the Norwegian Arctic, had one estrus female, and there were 12 males that were, I guess you might say, courting her. And there was blood everywhere. There were wounded bears lying off to the side, and it was clear there was one victor that was going to be the eventual sire for those cubs.
And I think that that gets back to the sparring that we see around here. If it's true that these bears are sparring as a way of kind of assessing each other's prowess, that can head off some of those serious injuries when it comes when the breeding season in the spring comes around. I found a bear many years ago in the Beaufort Sea, an enormous male that had broken its upper jaw. So its upper jaw was just kind of like flapping, and he was extremely skinny. Obviously, his major trophic appendages had been limited in their ability, and he was going to die. There's no way around that. And that kind of an injury is the kind of thing that you sometimes see when polar bears lock their jaws and are fighting with each other. And, you know, if they're doing that to each other very frequently, that's probably not very good for the population. So a way of heading that off is probably a pretty good thing.
Right. And so a lot of this competition among males, that really leads to this almost dimorphism that we see in the polar bear populations with females and males. Can you talk a bit about the size? We also see polar bears out here. There's one near a buggy right now, and just how big they are here, how big the females get, maybe how big the males get.
Yeah, I think we both have lots of observations to that, but adult males are 50% taller and twice as heavy sometimes as adult females. In the Beaufort Sea in Alaska, the biggest bear that I ever caught was 1,400 pounds. That was an adult male. The biggest female I ever caught was about 800 pounds, and she was, honest to God, so fat she could hardly move. But the male, I mean, he was just enormous and fit and ready to get the game on if he needed to. He was a big guy, and when you see them together, it's really impressive how much bigger males are than females, and that's because the males are doing this, you know, challenging each other, fighting each other, testing each other from the very beginnings.
That's tough.
It's interesting because when if you get a mother coming out of the denning area in the springtime, and if she's got one male cub and one female cub, she does an excellent job of keeping them both about the same size. So when they're about 3 months, 4 months, that's when we see them leaving the denning areas. But it's pretty neat because by the fall at this time, already the males have got a jump on body size on their female sibling. So we're not sure how it is, if they're just eating more, taking more milk from the mother. It's clear that they're on a different growth trajectory. So what happens is most females hit their mature body size about 4 to 5 years of age, and they just stop. And then their energy is devoted into producing cubs. The males keep going for another 3 to 4 or 5 years and keep increasing in size because we don't see much evidence of reproduction in those males until they're sort of in their early teens. So they keep devoting their energy into getting bigger and bigger. So there's quite a different strategy between the two sexes. And that also leads to some interesting ramifications. We tend to see the male polar bears eating more bearded seals than we see the females. So, and of course, that's a function of the fact that a bearded seal is, anywhere from 4 to 5 times larger than a ring seal and a lot bigger meal package to control. It's not hard to kill a bearded seal, but they, of course, don't want to be caught, and they're incredibly powerful animals that really, their main strategy is to roll when they get caught and try to roll back into the water. And of course, a big, strong male is much more able to control a seal like that.
I have a question for Andy. So related to the size difference, in Alaska, my last few years, we were starting to see a few really small, obviously young males that had been successful in accompanying females. I don't know if they were actually getting a chance to breed, but in the earlier years, we'd never see those young guys have a chance because the big males were always fending them off. Do you see anything like that around here with what appears to be?
We have seen that, and it's interesting because the males can actually produce viable sperm much before they're actually involved in normal breeding activities. But even in Svalbard, we had males that were clearly reproducing, and from our genetic data from following bears in this population, some males as young as 4 years old are actually fathering cubs. We're not sure why. It may be something to do with the harvest that occurs in some areas. That if you look at the harvest, and this is mainly a subsistence harvest for Inuit people, they almost always take males. And so what we're seeing is a bit of a skewing of the sex ratio in a lot of these populations, and that may be freeing up opportunities for some of the younger males to get into the breeding pool. But we're not really sure. Some of these dynamics are hard to study, and it happens often far out on the sea ice.
Really interesting. So we have a question about, let me find it. They were wondering if siblings that are raised together, maybe later on in life, come hang out together again. Do we know anything about these groups of bears that seem to kind of congregate? Are they related? Do we know?
We have looked at that because we have a very good pedigree. We don't see strong associations, but it wouldn't strike me as at all unusual that bears that are related would be on the same point of land during the summer or on the same area or out here. And part of that is because the bears show very strong fidelity to coming back to this area. So bears that are offshore here were probably born in this denning area. And so it's quite likely that you could be here with your half sibling. That would probably be more likely than your full sibling. We don't really have a good understanding of whether or not they can identify each other. We think a lot of species can, and it's probably something to do with the sense of smell that you just don't smell right as a potential mate, because we do not see very much inbreeding. So there's several reasons for that. One of them is that males have a very short breeding period, so it's very unlikely that they would ever have a chance to breed with one of their daughters, just because of the temporal spatial separation. But we don't see anything like that. So it's an interesting question. I think they do know other bears here, though. I think they have. When you watch two bears come up, they do a lot of sort of ritualized behaviors, and they seem to sniff each other over really closely. I mean, it's no different than watching two dogs meet on the street. I think they definitely remember other dogs that are out there, and that sort of familiarity is really important when you're out on the sea ice and you're thinking, do I want to follow this female that smells really interesting and a potential breeding partner, but oh my goodness, I mean, I see who's following her. I'm not going after that one. I'm going to go look for another mate.
Right.
In the Beaufort Sea of Alaska, in the early years up there, the 1980s and into the mid-1990s, we were doing research in the spring and in the fall when the ice reformed. And in that time, we would see numerous pairs of young bears that we assumed were siblings, but we weren't sure. In those days, we weren't doing the genetics tests that are possible now. But they were hanging out together. They were the same size. Sometimes it was a male and a female. Sometimes it was two males. And we just guessed that they were probably siblings, that they had come along for 2.5 years with their mother. They had been ejected from the household in the spring during breeding season, but they just continued to hang out together. And, so I think that there is some of that going on. We see some pairs of bears around here that look like that might be the case. But again, why that might occur, what benefit it is to them, and proving it are different questions.
Interesting. Thank you. We have a question from Joe Killian. Are there reports of the polar bears expanding their range for seeking food into more popular places in Canada?
Well, one of the things that we're seeing is a lot more human-bear conflicts. So the next town past Churchill, Manitoba, up towards in Nunavut is Arviat, and there's a place where, because the sea ice is delayed in formation, we're getting a lot more bears that just walk along land. They move northward. They seem to know that the ice will form further north sooner. And of course what happens is you get into these communities, and a lot of people store meat and food outside. So if you kill a muskox or a caribou or a seal, a lot of times you keep it outside because it's plenty cold enough. It's almost like an outdoor freezer. The bears smell that and they think jackpot and walk right into town. So it's interesting. Churchill, Manitoba, the town quite close to where we are, has an excellent bear management program of keeping bears out of trouble and making sure that people control their garbage and their food storage so that we don't have problem bears. And that never used to be an issue farther north, but the longer that the bay is open, it just gives bears more time to get into trouble. And hungry bears are also more likely to get into trouble with humans as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question from the standpoint of what are the impacts of the changing habitat around here. One of the things that we see is that when bears are forced to deal with less food for a longer period, they're not just going to lay down and die. They're going to start looking for something else to eat. And often that brings them into places where people are around and into conflicts. And this isn't just polar bears. Some of you might have read a few years ago there was an abundance of black bears that showed up on golf courses in the Tucson, Arizona area. Well, it wasn't because they wanted to play golf, and it wasn't because there were suddenly a lot more black bears. It was because it had been a couple of dry years. There wasn't much food up in the mountains, and the only green, lush places that they could find were near the city on these golf courses. And similarly, we have around here, we have some people who are seeing bears in places they didn't see them before in greater numbers than they used to see them, and they're interpreting that as meaning that there are more bears. Actually, what it means is the bears are having a tougher time, and they're moving around more and being seen in places where they previously weren't seen very often.
Interesting. So we also had a question about whether polar bear populations are increasing, decreasing, staying stable. If people are seeing more bears, they might think that the population's increasing, but can you comment on what the populations are doing? And maybe we should mention how many populations there are across the world and how different they might be.
Well, there's 19 recognized subpopulations of polar bears in the world, and at last count, I think we had one of them was increasing, 4 were decreasing, 5 were assessed as stable, and the remainder, we don't have enough information to know what's really going on with them. Part of the issue with whether or not a population has an assessment at all is what we know about them. And unfortunately, polar bears live in faraway places that are difficult to get to study. And so there's a lot that we just don't know about populations around the world. We believe that many of the populations out there are indeed probably doing okay right now. This population in western Hudson Bay, the one that I spent most of my time with in the southern Beaufort Sea of Alaska, those look like they're already in trouble from declining habitat availability. Others, we imagine that, and all of the evidence that we have suggests that what's happening here and what's happening in the Beaufort Sea of Alaska is what's likely to come to them if we don't get a handle on a warming climate.
I think that's pretty much the scenario, and I think the important thing to say is that with these 19 different populations, we're going to have 19 different scenarios play out, but they'll play out differently in time, but they all look about the same. The sea ice declines, and then what we see is the decline in the body condition of the bears. We see a reduction in the growth and size of the bears. We then see a decline in reproduction and survival, and then ultimately, because polar bears are long-lived animals, then we see the decline in the abundance. So there's a very sort of staged process, and it's interesting. This population was one of the first ones where we detected change. The Beaufort Sea is another one where we've detected change. We're seeing indications to the south of us in southern Hudson Bay, and you'd say, well, southern Hudson Bay is further south than we are here. Well, why isn't that one showing the changes sooner? it comes back to, again, the sea ice issue. And it's about how the sea ice moves in the Hudson Bay, and we've got this, what we call a gyre here, and the sea ice moves counterclockwise. And so the last ice that occurs in Hudson Bay in the summer is actually off the coast of Ontario to the south of us. So that population is showing a decline in body condition, but its abundance hasn't dropped yet. So again, it's a complex story, and there's a lot of people that are interested in trying to confuse the issue, because in reality, the polar bear climate change story is really very simple. Polar bears need sea ice to live. The sea ice is declining, and that's very well documented by sea ice scientists around the world. And the future of sea ice is not very good. So it's the simplest story, and that's why a lot of the climate change deniers are so keen on trying to blur the facts about polar bear science. It's a simple story. It's habitat loss. It's no different than parrots and monkeys losing their habitat in the Amazon forest. It's just a little bit more challenging when you're dealing with a habitat that's so dynamic as sea ice that sort of melts and then reforms. And it's just a habitat like any other, and it's disappearing. And it's disappearing at quite a rate, depending on which month of the year we look at. But it's a challenge certainly going forward for the bears.
I would like to add something to that. So Andy was talking about the relationship between polar bears and sea ice, and how it might be different. There might be 19 different stories out there, and the Beaufort Sea and the Hudson Bay situation are exactly different stories with kind of the same ending. So here, the issue is that the ice has always melted. In human history, the ice has always melted entirely, forcing all of the bears ashore, but now they're forced ashore earlier, and they have to stay longer. In the Beaufort Sea, the situation is that the bears never used to come ashore. When I first went to Alaska in the early 1980s, people hardly ever saw polar bears on land. Now they see them on land all the time, because the sea ice that used to be right offshore in their favorite hunting areas is no longer there. Those bears are either forced to come onto land, or they drift way out onto the high Arctic pack ice, where we know it's very unproductive, and we believe that they're not catching very many seals. In both cases, the result is the same: reduced survival, reduced body size and stature, and ultimately it's going to be population declines.
And so sea ice definitely affects hunting opportunities, but Judy has a question. Has global warming changed the polar bear's mating habits? And are there less polar bears being born in a year's time?
That's an interesting issue. It doesn't appear that we've seen major changes yet. But one of our big concerns is, of course, polar bears find mates by tracking them. And they track them by following basically the scents that females leave behind. And it's interesting when you watch a male in the springtime, and when they're traveling, it's almost like they're doing a survey. And they just follow these incredibly straight lines, and then they hit a set of tracks. And in just a few steps, they'll decide, is this a female that's in estrus, that's a potential breeding mate, or not? And if not, they go back on their compass bearing, and they just keep going till they cross the next set of tracks. And so the concern is that as the sea ice changes and becomes a lot more dynamic, is that rather than having this nice solid surface that the bears are traveling over, it starts to break up. And of course, the ice is moving on the wind, the tides, the currents, and it's basically you start to scramble the tracks. And so we think that there's a very high likelihood that male polar bears may have a harder time finding females as the sea ice starts to break up earlier in the spring. Are we seeing that yet? No. We're not seeing clear evidence of it, but from some of our analyses, we see that as one of the potential impacts of climate change. The other thing is, if you just move ice more, it's like turning up the speed on a treadmill, so the bears have to counteract that drifting sea ice as well. So there's a lot of different things going on in the Arctic. We're seeing changes in the food, we're seeing changes in the ice, and changes to some extent in polar bear behavior, migration, movement rates, and things like this. So it's an incredibly dynamic time, and it's difficult to sometimes pick out all the pieces of the story.
I'd like to add one thing to that, is if you're interested in learning more about how polar bears might be able to follow the scent of other bears, there's a brand new article just came out by Dr. Megan Owen from San Diego Zoo, and you can go just about any place online and type in polar bear sniffing or polar bear scent, and you'll probably pull up news stories about that article, and then there'll be a link that you can probably track down the article. Very interesting pioneering work that backs up the kind of thing that Andy was just talking about.
That's great. So we have a question from Catherine about how we follow the bears. So first of all, do we name the polar bears, and then how do we track them?
We don't name them, but it's kind of a neat system. The 5 nations with polar bears, so that's Canada, Greenland, Norway, Russia, and the United States and Alaska, very long ago developed a system of numbers. So each bear gets a specific number that's assigned to them. That number is never used again for the same bear anywhere. And in association with that, they also have a letter at the very beginning. So all bears in Canada, their numbers start with an X, and all the bears in Alaska start with an A. It's kind of an interesting, I'm not sure why Canada got an X, but we did. Norway got the N and we got an X. But it's kind of a good system, because it means that if a bear crosses a boundary, right away we're not looking in our database to say, well, this bear, where is it in our database? No, it's actually from Alaska. So then we talk to our colleagues. There's extremely high levels of cooperation in the circumpolar Arctic across polar bear scientists. Many of us are members of the Polar Bear Specialist Group that's under the auspices of the IUCN and Species Survival Commission. So we get together every few years and we coordinate research activities as well. So we don't name the bears. What you'll see is sometimes, like, we're following bears by satellite collars, and we provide that group, that information to nonprofit organizations like Polar Bears International, World Wildlife Fund, and then they like to give names to the bears. But we have really exciting names like X9344. I mean, I have some favorites. Some of them are no longer with us. Like X505 was a bear that lived up around Churchill for years. Incredibly productive female that left lots of genes in this population. She was also kind of characteristic, so you could always tell it was X505 because she had this sway back that looked like a really old draft horse that had been overworked. But I think she'd been overworked by raising some pretty good cubs.
That's so cool. So BJ pulled up on the screen there for everyone to see the Polar Bear International Bear Tracker. And so you can tune in through the PBI website throughout the year, and you can follow, I think we've got 17 bears or something across Hudson Bay there, 5 from this population and some from the southern Hudson Bay population. And you can watch them throughout the year and see how different they go. They all kind of like to do their own thing out there on the bay, and you can watch how far they travel. They just have huge home ranges and travel hundreds of kilometers, so it's very interesting to see what they're doing out there.
Another reason that we don't name the bears is we probably aren't imaginative enough to come up with the large number of names that we would need. Both Andy and I have captured hundreds and hundreds of polar bears and put ear tags in them, and I can't remember that many names.
No, it would be a challenge, and it's a lot easier to keep track of your animals when they're all nicely aligned by a number. Scientists are kind of orderly about that sort of thing, and again, in this population around us, it used to be 1,200 bears when I first started working here. There's still 800 bears in this population. We're down a third, but that's still a lot of bears to have individual names for. And then when you multiply it by the fact that we've been studying this population for 40 years, I can't imagine what that database would look like if it was all by names.
No kidding.
And how you translate those names.
Yeah.
So people are pretty interested in some polar bear safety. So if a polar bear were to somehow approach you, so when we are out here on the Tundra buggy, we never get on the ground. So we're up high, we're safe. We let the polar bears do their thing and the humans do our own thing. But if we somehow got in a situation where you came across a polar bear in the field, what would you do? Someone says, is it the right thing to do to just stay perfectly still? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well,
people are very interested in this.
It depends on the situation to a very great extent. If there is a safe place that you can get to, for example, maybe you're out hiking but you're not very far from your vehicle, like if we went out here, for some reason we were on the ground adjacent to the Tundra buggy, we could do something like drop a hat or something like that to distract the bear so that we could get back to a safe place. If you were out in an area where you couldn't do that, then one of the most important things you could be doing is carrying what's called bear pepper spray, so that if the bear did approach you, you would have a non-lethal way of deterring it. That's been shown to be very effective in other bears. As long as you keep the bear pepper spray warm, it probably works pretty well up here. But I think the biggest thing is to, when you're out in bear country, whether it's polar bear country or any bear country, to really have your antennae up and be paying attention to what's going on around you, so that you don't get surprised by a bear at short distance that reduces your options of response.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the key things. So whenever we're out on the ice, we always have somebody watching for bears. You have to remember, these bears are experts at sneaking up on you. I mean, they use the ice or the terrain to get close to where you are. I mean, they don't really know what we are, so they usually come in on humans with sort of this air of cautiousness. That's what you want to see. But the problem is, the dangerous bears are really the young bears and the really skinny bears, and those are unpredictable. But if you have the time to sort of see that the animal is approaching, you have a chance to respond. One of the things to do is, if there's a group of people, you get close together. Bears are much more reluctant about attacking a group. You can arm yourself. You might have firearms that you should be preparing. Very often we are carrying firearms during our research, but we also carry deterrents. So myself, I always have a small, what's called a small pen flare in my pocket. And it's always on me, and I can quickly get it out. It doesn't go very far, but if I can see the bear approaching, I can put that out. And most polar bears have never seen anything like that, and they take off almost instantly. We can fire warning shots, so you have to be prepared. Around our camps, we have a tripwire alarm system that we use as sort of our first layer of defense. If you don't have a fancy electronic alarm, we just put pots and things on a rope, and we stake it out there, so any bears coming in is going to start jingling these pots, and they usually give you a little bit of heads up that there's something going on. Having said that, I have over the years lost various parts on 2 different helicopters to polar bears in the Churchill area. Obviously our detection and deterrent systems weren't perfect. They didn't get us, but they got our helicopter.
That's funny. So kind of about the Churchill area, people also want to learn a little bit more about the polar bear holding facility and how that works, and if we've had bears there this year.
There have been bears in the Churchill holding facility this year, although I don't know how many. It seems like it's a slower year than it was last year. But the point of that is that if bears are persistent in coming into the community of Churchill, rather than destroying those bears, what the Department of Conservation in Manitoba has done is they've created this facility where they can basically put the bears in a holding pen and just keep them there, and then later on fly them out when the sea ice is a little bit closer to freezing up, fly them out to where they will hopefully go back out on the sea ice before coming in to town again. They do have many bears that keep coming back regardless, but they don't give them any food when they're in this holding facility, so there's not really a reward, and we don't think that bears really like being penned up in a little box, so it's probably a reasonably good deterrent for many of the bears to keep them out.
I'll just note that years ago, when the facility was first set up and we were working here in the 1980s, we were allowed to do some physiological studies in there. So it meant that we were feeding the bears, trying to understand this interesting dynamic that they have at this time of year called a walking hibernation. So we were trying to study that. And of course, we were feeding the bears. We had big tubs of blubber and whale meat. And the interesting thing was that we fed those bears, then we let them go. And one of the problems is that they broke into jail the following year. They learned that it wasn't such a bad place to be, so they broke into the polar bear jail. Then the wildlife officer said, I think we don't need to do any more research in D20 or the holding facility.
That's pretty
So rewarding them to be in jail.
Yeah, that was a bad idea.
They're really quick learners, correct? They're very
Yeah.
intelligent,
Oh,
very
yeah.
curious, learn very quickly. Yeah, pretty funny. So we have another question about the freeze up this year. So do you think that the ice freeze up is on schedule, and is there a certain number of days that we need to be below freezing for the sea ice to start forming out here?
We need some cold weather right now. It's interesting. We're looking at a bear on the camera, I think, right now that's pretty skinny, and obviously I think he just thundered off across
there's two
the
bears,
tundra
that's
there,
why.
and
Chasing
he doesn't want to be near another bear. So there's a lot of dynamics going on here. The one that we've got on camera right now has that really horizontal stomach, and he's not doing particularly well. But these bears really need to get out onto the sea ice. But again, typical of almost any population, what we see is sort of that bell-shaped curve of body conditions. Some bears are doing just fine, and some bears are definitely on the edge. The one that's coming up behind here is a lot better, but both of these bears really want to be out on the bay, and you can see it far off in the background there. There's no sea ice here yet at all. We need sort of temperatures down around minus 20 degrees C for an extended period of time to really start to create some sea ice. We don't know exactly when the sea ice is going to come back here, but right now there's no indication these bears are going anywhere anytime soon.
30 years ago, the ice might have been frozen up by this time of year. And here we are looking out, and there's no evidence of any sea ice at all. So it's got to get a lot colder for several days before we're going to see anything. One of the things that people ask that's related to that is, well, how do the bears look this year?
Yes, we get
And
that a lot.
so I think that's important to recognize the part that Andy just described, that there's this bell-shaped curve, that some bears are always going to be in better shape than others, either because they got lucky or they were more skilled hunters or whatever. And some are going to be not so good, and they're going to be thinner, and they're the ones that are most likely to fall off of the population. But when we come out here, we're always saying, oh, well, that bear looks pretty good, that bear maybe doesn't look so good. You can't really judge anything based on what you see with a small number of bears in any one year. What scientists are really interested in is the long-term trend in condition at the population level. There's always some bears that are going to be more fit, some bears that are going to be less fit. If conditions are good, they might all survive. If conditions are poor, only the most fit will survive. And that's kind of the situation that we're in now. A couple of weeks ago, when I first got up here this year, most of the bears that I was seeing were that description that Andy gave, where if you look from their shoulder to their rump, the belly just goes kind of straight across instead of having a nice deep belly. And I was concerned that, boy, the bears I'm seeing so far just don't look very good. This week, we've seen more bears that seem to be in better shape. Those other bears are probably still laying in the willows out there. They're just not showing themselves because they don't have as much energy as these. But they're all waiting for that sea ice to freeze.
Yeah, we've got some kind of unusual behavior on the screen right now. You don't usually see this chasing behavior at this time of year to this extent. We've seen it a couple of times in the last few days. It's unusual. We're not really sure. I mean, polar bears will attack and kill other polar bears, but you don't usually see polar bears run like this. The bear that's out front is definitely worried about this bear that's behind him. There is a potential of predation. That is something that we have seen in some years here. We have seen bears killing other bears and then eating them, and it sort of comes down to that survival of the fittest. And sometimes that means eating one of your own species when you're a polar bear. And we haven't seen it lately, but there was one year here where we had some males that were killing a lot of younger bears, and it's quite dramatic, but it's hard to put in context. Because we see some of these events so rarely, so it's hard to know how common they are and whether or not they're increasing in frequency or not.
Interesting. Anne is wondering whether it's the same bears that we see in this area year after year. Do a lot of them come back right around these buggies every year? Are we seeing new bears every year?
Well, because the bears show fidelity to this general area, to what we call sort of the Churchill population area and this coast, the bears show the same sorts of movement patterns year over year. So if you leaving from land on the north slope here around Wapusk National Park, if you leave from here, you probably left here last year and the year before. So yes, we are seeing some of the same bears. And that's why a lot of the bears really don't pay much attention to the tundra buggies or the infrastructure here. It's just part of their scenery. They're used to them being here. Sometimes you see bears come through that are clearly ones that seem a lot more suspicious about the whole tundra buggy lodge and facility here. And my guess is they may be ones that haven't come through here as often. But bears show, polar bears show incredibly high levels of fidelity. So these bears were born here, somewhere nearby, and they come back here year after year after year. They're not coming from any other population. So I'm sure we've seen some of these bears before. And of course, when we see them up close, we sometimes see the ear tags in them, which means that they have been handled in this area.
One of the things about those ear tags is that they're really small and they're white, and the lettering isn't colored, so you can't really read them from the Tundra buggy. But there have been enough bears here. I've been coming to Churchill since 2005, and there have been enough bears, or there have been several bears here that had individually identifiable scar patterns or other characteristics that you could see. And the buggy drivers, the guides up here that are interpreting information about polar bears to the public that comes up to visit, they would say, oh, well, Dancer is back again, or so-and-so is back again. And they could identify them because of that and because of their behaviors. So we know that some of these bears are coming back time and time again. And I think, you know, if we could read those ear tags, we'd know a lot more about that.
Well, the Tundra buggy drivers give the bears names because they see a lot of the same bears over and over.
Yeah.
We don't give them names. That bear, I think we figured out he was in the 9000s. He'd been around for a long time. We had a lot of history on that bear. They called him Dancer. We called him, I think it was 9334 or 9338 or something. It was kind of interesting. It's kind of cool because if we could reach out with some sort of pluckers, we could grab a few hairs from the bear. We could identify the bear that way. Or if they decided to defecate on the side of the trail, we could pick up a sample and actually identify the bear that way, because we could get DNA samples, and because we have such a great catalog of DNA in this population, we know exactly which bear it would be. It's actually so neat that we could actually probably go back and say who was their father and who was their mother, and we could go back and probably even go back a couple of generations. We have an amazing pedigree in this population.
That's pretty incredible. So we talked a little bit about Tundra buggies and people watching the bears from Tundra buggies. Someone's wondering whether the polar bears can smell people on Tundra buggies and how that might affect them, and do they get used to humans that way?
Well, they can clearly smell us. They smell the buggies. I mean, you can smell a car. We can smell a car ourselves when it's running. You know, it puts out a little bit of an odor. The bears can clearly smell it. They smell us. Sometimes I've suspected that when the buggy stops to feed the guests lunch, that the bears are well aware of that. The important thing is that they don't get any reward here. They might smell something. It might be interesting to them, but they don't get any food as a result of it. So for the most part, they pretty much seem to ignore the buggies here. And a part of that we didn't talk about earlier, but I think is really important to note, is that the Tundra buggies have been coming out here for almost 30 years, I think. And they have to stay on this old trail system that was developed by the military. So it's not as if these big buggies are just driving all over the tundra willy-nilly. They have to stay to these trail systems, so if a bear is bothered by the buggy, it can just move a little ways away and it doesn't have to deal with the buggies. The fact that many of the bears continue to hang around, I think, is really good evidence that they aren't very bothered by the buggies.
Nice. So we have a question from Love the Cams. Are polar bears concerned about the sea ice being a certain thickness before they will attempt to walk across it?
Oh yeah, that's for sure. I mean, it's pretty interesting. We were watching a bear yesterday, and it was doing pretty much what I call sort of the polar bear starfish routine. And bears seem to be able to sense incredibly well that the ice is flexing underneath them. And sea ice is quite interesting in that respect. Is, you know, you always think about walking on ice, but that's usually freshwater ice, and it fractures catastrophically, and then you fall through, and then you're in trouble. Not if you're a polar bear, but if you're out on the sea ice, it flexes underneath you. And so it's a very different sort of substrate. Now, the bears can sense that. And one of the first things they do is they basically start to go spread eagle. They basically try to get their weight over a bigger area. And then if they start to break through, their paws get wider and wider. And they really don't want to break through. It's a lot of work to get back on top, especially on thin ice. So what they do is they spread themselves out. If it's getting really soft, then they'll lie down on their bellies, and then they'll sort of scooch along and pull themselves, try to get to some thicker ice. So they definitely need ice that's reasonably thick. They don't want to fall in the water. It's incredible when you see a bear in that broken ice and moving across it. it just looks exhausting for the bears, and they do everything they can to avoid it. While they don't mind swimming, it's not their preferred mode of locomotion. So here's a bear we got on the screen there, I think, showing you that he's just broken through. But it gives you some sort of sense of the challenges of moving through this young ice. They really want much more consolidated ice. They want it really well frozen up before they can travel out. But at this time of year, they really do follow the advancing edge of the newly formed ice, probably because there's some seals out there that haven't seen polar bears for several months, and they're vulnerable to predation.
Yeah, it's kind of like a race between the conditions that the seals want to have to start to maintain their breathing holes, and the ice getting thick enough that it'll support bears so bears can catch the seals when they're maintaining their breathing holes. As the ice is skinning up, ring seals immediately start to break through the ice. They'll do what we call push-ups. They'll just take their nose and they'll push up through the thin ice and pop a little cap of ice off to the side. You see this little hole, and then as the ice thickens, they maintain that breathing hole with the claws on their front flippers. Well, while they're maintaining those breathing holes is a perfect time for polar bears to catch them. And when the ice is thin, it tends to freeze faster because it's not insulating itself very well. So if the polar bear can get out there when the ice is thin, it has a good chance, a better chance perhaps, of catching those seals when they're first starting to maintain those holes. Later on, when the ice is really, really thick, the seal might be coming up to breathe someplace down inside that hole and not as vulnerable to the bears. So, it's both of these things are going on at the same time. The bears need a certain thickness. The seals want to start maintaining their breathing holes as soon as there's ice forming. And where does that meet in order to allow the polar bear to make a living?
So Pitchy was wondering, is the seal population increasing or decreasing, and is that a factor in polar bear survival?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. There's some monitoring work that's being done in the Hudson Bay system, and it's a noisy component of the polar bear world. Seals are much more challenging to study, ring seals in particular. They're hard to catch. There's tens of thousands of them in the Hudson Bay system, so they're incredibly abundant, which you might think make it easy, but it's very challenging to catch ring seals, and this has been a problem for almost everybody. You have to use nets or some sort of device that, when they haul out on the ice, it shuts off their hole, and the seals are incredibly wary. But from doing some aerial survey work here, scientists work for the Canadian government and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. They've been looking at this population. It looks like it's on a slow decline. So one of the things we don't know is it on a decline because of sea ice changes, or there is some suggestion that ring seals decline and perhaps go through some sort of cyclical behavior over time. The problem is our understanding of sort of seal cycles is pretty rudimentary. We know that they are affected by environmental conditions and marine productivity as well. But there is this indication that the population of seals is slipping, which would have ramifications for polar bears. But our insights on seals is pretty darn poor overall.
Yeah, I think the situation with seals is very much parallel to the situation with polar bears. We are mostly concerned about the future for polar bears, the next several polar bear generations. What's going to happen as their sea ice habitat continues to deteriorate and they have less and less time out there to feed. Ring seals in the spring of the year make these little caves that they're above the surface of the ice but below the surface of the snow, and it's in those caves that they give birth to their pups. And the pups don't do well if they're born out in the open or if they're forced to be out in the open at a very young age. Well, as the ice is freezing ever later, the early season snowfall doesn't land on top of the ice and move around and drift and make for a place where they can make these caves. It goes into the water. So with the ice freezing ever later, it's likely that we're going to be seeing less and less ice or less and less snow on top of the ice, and less snow means less habitat for ring seals to make these layers. Then on top of that, with warmer seasons in the spring, we might see more rain events on top of the existing layers, melting them out and causing the seals, the pups, to be exposed on the surface of the ice. And when they're just out exposed, they're vulnerable not just to bears, but to foxes, to gulls, to ravens, to a whole variety of other risks, just to exposure for that matter. So there's a lot of things that we haven't quantified yet, but are reasons for concern.
Right. So our last question of the day will be then, are you optimistic about the future of polar bears, and do you think there's still time to reverse this global warming and sea ice decline?
Well, I know we both have thoughts about that. I'll start by saying we do still have time. Work that my colleagues and I have done and lots of other people have done shows that we do still have time to save polar bears. We can save the sea ice. Perhaps not in every area where polar bears currently live, but we can save a lot of it, and we can save polar bears if we get our act together and stop the rise in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Having said that, we have an issue of possibility versus plausibility, and I am actually hopeful that we're going to make that jump from the physical possibility to the political plausibility and allow ourselves to be able to continue to see polar bears into the future. But we got to move on it. It's not something that we can just sit back and wait.
I would echo those opinions, and I think it's very clear when we look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the recent reports that were put out, the time to act is now. One of the first things we have to do collectively is understand the problems that we're facing, and we have very, very clear scientific data that climate change is caused by humans. So humans have to collectively find the answers. And it's not about waiting for country X or Y to come on board. It's about individual nations to take a leadership role on this issue and bring forward a positive change. As Steve mentioned, we're not going to keep polar bears in all areas. That is very clear from the scientific data that we have to date. And looking forward in time, it's going to be a challenge to hold on to polar bears even in the high Arctic. But our best estimates are we will have them in the high Arctic out to the end of this century. That gives us a bit of time to get our act together and bring down the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and then eventually over perhaps hundreds or thousands of years, the climate will change back to a more normal level. It's amazing. I mean, we have changed it fundamentally, and it's our responsibility not only to current people on this planet, but to future generations to do something about climate change. We're talking about polar bears today, and that's our focus and a focus of my research. But if you go further into the future, by the time polar bears are in serious trouble, it's not going to be about polar bears anymore. It's going to be about trying to maintain civilization as we know it, with issues like sea level rise and coral bleaching that's occurring in many areas across the world. Many, many species are at risk from climate change. It's just a question of fairness. What do we want to leave future generations?
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much. This week at Polar Bears International, it was Polar Bear Week, and on our website we've got all sorts of great actions that you can take to help polar bears, doing little things like not idling your car, turning down your thermostat, turning off your lights, and also bigger actions like signing our petition for polar bears that will go to the UN Climate Summit and tell them that we really need to take meaningful change to act now for polar bears. And we want to thank you so much for joining today. Thank you, BBC Earth, for having us. Thank you so much to Explore.org. Without them, these live cams could not happen. We've been able to bring you polar bears today and some really interesting activities outside because of these live cams. We'd also like to thank Frontiers North Adventures, of course, for hosting us on Buggy One and the Tundra Buggy Lodge. Without them, none of this would happen either. And Polar Bears International, thanks you all for being here. My name's Alysa McCall. Please keep tuning in. We're still going to be around for a couple weeks watching polar bears out here on the tundra. We're going to keep answering your questions and having a few other live chats. And thank you so much to Dr. Steve Amstrup and Dr. Andy Derocher for bringing all their knowledge to you today. So have a great day and keep watching polar bears, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks for everything you're doing.
Bye for now.